August 26, 1985. Employees at the SEPTA train yard in Frankford, Philadelphia, begin their morning like any other. That is, until they stumble across the body of a woman between the rows of stacked railroad ties. Investigators quickly arrive to find a nightmarish sight that is so horrific and disturbing, it feels like they've stumbled into one of the crime scenes of the infamous Jack the Ripper. The victim is partially dressed, with her blouse open to expose her chest, and her legs positioned in a way meant to further demean her. She's been stabbed 47 times in the chest and head, including a deep slash across her abdomen that reveals her internal organs. There is no doubt that they are dealing with a murder, one that's been carried out by an extremely brutal and vicious killer. The victim is quickly identified as Helen Patent, with her ex-husband Kermit being called to confirm. Though the two were no longer married, they still shared a suburban home, living mostly independent lives, and Kermit explained that it wasn't unusual for Helen to leave without mentioning her plans, having last seen her a week before on August 19th. Despite the extremely violent nature of the crime, however, investigators struggled to find any evidence, any leads, or even any motives. All they had to speculate on was that Helen was a frequent visitor of several bars in the area, which perhaps could have been where she encountered whoever had attacked and murdered her. But the murder of Helen was only the start of the violence that Frankford was about to bear witness to. Because what detectives didn't yet know was that they had just stumbled across the first victim of a serial killer who was about to spend the next 5 years terrorizing the neighborhood. In total, 9 victims would be discovered. All of them were white women who frequented bars along a specific 3-block stretch of Frankford Avenue, between Wakeling and Bridge Streets. And all of them were brutally attacked, stripped, and left in sexually suggestive poses. As a result, their killer would come to be known as The neighborhood of Frankford was once prosperous, but it had fallen into economic decline by the mid-1980s, deteriorating into a hub of crime, addiction, and prostitution. It did, however, have a lively nightlife of bustling bars that drew people in from all over. And it was this collective environment that unknowingly created the perfect hunting ground for a killer. On January 3, 1986, around 4 months after Helen's body was discovered, 68-year-old Anna Carroll was found lying dead in her bedroom, her apartment door having been left wide open. Though she had been stabbed fewer times, 6 in total, the mutilation was just as horrific, with her organs similarly exposed with a deep wound from her breast to her groin, and she was positioned in a similarly suggestive way to Helen. Although the murder occurred a few miles away from where Helen was found, and there were clear similarities between the two crime scenes, investigators didn't immediately treat the cases as connected, although they did discover that Anna was known to frequent the same bars in Frankfurt as Helen. They didn't find this fact particularly remarkable. Not yet, anyway. One of these bars, located on the 5200 block of Frankfurt Avenue near the train terminal where Helen was discovered, was called the Golden Bar. For over a year, the two murders remained separate open cases with no real leads, and after Anna's murder, there was an eerie silence. That is, until Christmas Day of 1986. On Christmas Day, neighbors discovered 64-year-old Susan Olsheff dead in her Richmond Street apartment, near Frankfurt Avenue, having been stabbed 6 times in the back. Just like the last 2 victims, Susan was a regular at the Golden Bar. But once again, police failed to connect her murder to the previous 2 cases. But then everything changed mere weeks later on January 8, 1987, when a 4th victim was found, and police finally started connecting the dots. Under a fruit and vegetable stand on Pratt Street, just off Frankfurt Avenue and alarmingly close to where Helen was found, the body of 28-year-old Jean Durkin was discovered by a restaurant worker. Having lived on the streets for a number of years, Jean was known to frequently sleep in the doorway of an abandoned bakery just down the block from the Golden Bar. Once again, the crime scene was nightmarish, showing signs of unparalleled violence. A nearby fence and truck were both covered in blood, with Jean having been stabbed 74 times in the chest, back, and buttocks. Her body had been left partially nude, with her legs spread, and signs that she had been sexually assaulted. It seemed extremely clear to the press that the city was dealing with a serial killer, and the media began to demand action from the police who had so far seemingly made no progress at all in any of the investigations. Finally realizing the cases were likely connected, the police set up a task force to investigate the serial killer the press had begun to call the Frankford Slasher. With the Golden Bar being a direct connection to all 4 victims, investigators spent hours questioning a bartender who told them he had seen all 4 victims in the bar, including Jean, who frequently came inside throughout the winter months to stay warm. The bartender told them that Susan Olszef and Anna Carroll had both definitely been in the bar in the days before their murders, though he couldn't offer any specific dates or times. He did, however, suspect that the murderer might be a regular customer as a result. Police questioned various regulars of the bar, but didn't uncover anything of interest. The more they looked into Jean, the more apparent it became that she would not have been an easy target for the killer. In one notable incident in the recent past, 6 police officers had attempted to arrest her, but she resisted so fiercely that they had to let her go. This led investigators to think that her killer may have been someone she knew, using charm rather than physical strength to overpower her. Similarly, it had been suggested that Helen, the first victim, would never have wandered off to the train tracks with a stranger, perhaps implying that she too had known or at least felt comfortable with her attacker. Police did follow a lead involving another woman called Michelle Daner, who had argued over a blanket with Jean the night before her murder, but ultimately found nothing connecting her to the crime. Towards the end of January, a crowd from the neighborhood gathered at the train station, holding candles in memory of the 4 victims. Despite the similarities in the murders, police were still not 100% certain the cases were actually connected, especially when no more victims were discovered matching the same pattern. However, any doubts they had would soon be laid to rest, as the Frankford Slasher was far from finished with his murder spree. A couple of weeks later, the frozen and partially clothed body of Catherine M. Jones, 29, was discovered. However, she had not been stabbed. She had been bludgeoned to death, with her skull having been crushed and her jaw having been broken. At the time, this case was seen as unrelated to the previous 4 murders, but it would later be suspected of being the 5th of the Frankford Slasher's crimes. After this, no further victims of the slasher were discovered, at least not until nearly 2 years later in November 1988. In the meantime, a number of other shocking murder cases unfolded in the area that initially led authorities to thinking they may have found a suspect. For example, Gary Heidnik was arrested in April 1987 after a woman escaped from his house claiming he had held her captive alongside other women. This led police to raid his home, where they discovered 3 half-dead women he had been keeping as sex slaves. After his arrest, he admitted to eating pieces of his victims and feeding the remains to his other captives. Not long after that, in August, Harrison Graham was evicted from his apartment only a mile away from Heidnik's home due to foul odors. Upon investigating, police discovered the decomposing bodies of 6 women, alongside the remains of a 7th. Graham initially tried to claim the bodies were there when he moved in, but later confessed to strangling the 7 women during sex. Bizarrely, it appears these 2 serial killers, who despite their similar crimes and actions appear to have had no connection to one another, were operating entirely separately at the same time as the Frankford Slasher in the exact same area. Because even if anyone suspected either of these men were actually the slasher, they were both in prison by the time he finally struck again. On November 11, 1988, residents of an apartment building on Penn Street, close to where Jean's body had been discovered, stumbled upon a horrific scene in the building's foyer: the body of 66-year-old Margaret Vaughn. Having been evicted from the same apartment building the same day after failing to pay her rent, Margaret was found having been stabbed 29 times and suffering a similarly grotesque fate to the previous victims, leading police to believe that the slasher had returned. But unlike the previous murders, this time a witness came forward claiming to have seen Margaret the night before she was killed. A barmaid saw Margaret drinking at her bar with a round-faced Caucasian man who wore glasses and walked with a limp, so police quickly put a sketch together, widely circulating it in the hopes that someone would recognize the man. Although they received numerous tips, none led to a viable suspect. Many calls they received were from elderly women suspecting their bus drivers, or from disgruntled neighbors pointing fingers at someone they didn't like. Some psychics also offered unhelpful advice, and one tip even suggested witchcraft might be involved. Although there was genuinely a cult practicing near a local park, this lead was ultimately dismissed. Authorities also had a lead on a suspect, a middle-aged white man, identified as a minister who worked in the area. However, he vanished during the investigation and was never heard from again. Ultimately, as with all the previous murders, no real evidence was discovered, and the investigation quickly hit a dead end. Then, on January 19, 1989, a few blocks away on Arrett Street, Teresa Sciortino, 30, was found stabbed 25 times in her apartment. An outpatient undergoing mental health care after years spent in psychiatric institutions, she was discovered nude, wearing only white socks, lying face up in a pool of blood in her kitchen. She had been violated with a piece of wood before she was stabbed and slashed across her arms, chest, and face. The killer left the bloodied piece of wood leaning against the sink, and even left a bloody shoe print this time. There was blood all over the apartment, indicating to detectives that an intense struggle between her and her attacker had taken place. Teresa was known to frequent the bars on Frankford Avenue, where she often entertained male companions. One of her neighbors recalled seeing her with a middle-aged white man at the Jolly Post Tavern the night before she was found, and shortly after another neighbor claimed to have heard a struggle in the apartment that same night. Because the murder took place so long after the last kill linked to the slasher, medical examiner Dr. Hoyer initially dismissed arguments that a serial killer was responsible, claiming serial killers typically strike more frequently, often within weeks. Despite this, police couldn't help but note the similarities between the victims. They were all white. They frequented the same bars in the same area. They had been violently assaulted, stabbed numerous times, and there was little to no evidence left at the scene. Police interviewed multiple patrons and employees of the bars the various victims had been seen in, but no substantial leads were uncovered. They even searched nearby sewers and trash bins, hoping to find a discarded murder weapon. But again, they found nothing. They did investigate a man who wore shoes similar to the print found at the scene who knew the victim, with some reports claiming he was her boyfriend, but they were unable to link him to the crime. Despite increased patrols and plainclothes officers observing women entering and leaving local bars, authorities failed to identify a solid suspect. By this point, they had already investigated over 50 men and had 2 under surveillance, with leads on a third. Yet the lack of a clear pattern in the killings made their investigation difficult. Investigators were baffled. How could someone commit such brutal, bloody murders yet leave behind no trace of evidence, or never be seen presumably covered in blood? Suspects were arrested and released, theories proposed and disproven, but no answers emerged. More than a year passed before the slasher struck again on April 29, 1990, when a patrol officer stumbled across the body of 46-year-old Carol Dowd in an alley behind Newman Seafood in Frankford Avenue. Carol had been brutally mutilated, having been stabbed 36 times in the face, neck, chest, and back, and her face had been badly bludgeoned. Defensive wounds on her hands suggested she had fought back. Like some of the other victims, her stomach had been slashed open, spilling out her intestines. Though this time the slasher had also removed her left nipple. Once again, her body was left positioned in a provocative manner. Her clothing and purse was discovered nearby in an alley, with nothing appearing to have been stolen. Because the patrol officer had previously been in the area investigating a burglary, it was estimated that Carol had been killed sometime between midnight and around 2 in the morning. Witnesses came forward claiming to have seen Carol with an older white man just hours before her body was found, matching the description of the suspect seen with the previous victims. Carol had a long history of mental health issues, having been diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and spending time institutionalized. She had then struggled after being assaulted not long after her release. Though most recently she had been living in a community facility, where she had appeared to be happy and content. It seemed apparent that the killer was targeting particularly vulnerable women, almost all of whom suffered with mental health or addiction issues. The police were confident that Carol's killer was the slasher due to the similarities in the murder, despite the significant time that had passed since their last suspected attack. The crime also bore similarities to the murder of Catherine, leading police to suspect she was also a victim of the slasher. Theorizing that the killer was perhaps following his victims once they left local bars where he would abduct and assault them, led police to question employees of the nearby fish market, leading to a potential breakthrough in the case. Leonard Christopher, an African-American employee at the fish market who lived nearby, had previously commented on the crimes, calling the alley a prostitute's paradise and a hotspot for drug activity. Having known Carol, when questioned by police, Leonard volunteered that he had also known one of the previous victims, Margaret Vaughn, raising their suspicions. Being familiar with the area and at least 2 of the victims raised red flags for the investigators, especially when he gave them inconsistent details about his whereabouts the night of the murder. He initially told them he had been with his girlfriend, but when questioned she contradicted him by telling them that she had been at home alone. Despite every sighting of every victim describing an older white man with them prior to their deaths, this discrepancy in Leonard's story led police to take him in for further questioning. And then an individual came forward claiming to have seen Leonard with Carol at a nearby bar the night she was killed, and 2 sex workers reported that they had seen him at Newman's around the time of Carol's murder, with one claiming that he was carrying a knife. Had the police finally found the Frankford Slasher? Searching Leonard's apartment, police discovered a bloodstain on a pair of trousers, but at the time it was too small to be tested and linked to the crime. With all of his co-workers vouching for his character and defending him, they explained to police that the tiny speck of blood they found was from a previous burglary in the alley which Leonard had been ordered to clean up by their boss. Regardless, police formally arrested him on May 5th and charged him with robbery, abuse of a corpse, murder, and possession of an instrument of crime. They also denied him bail. On June 20th, it was announced that Leonard would stand trial for the murder of Carol Dowd, with the evidence against him being considered sufficient. However, this evidence was entirely circumstantial, and mostly centered on the two sex workers who claimed to have seen him that night around the time of the attack. One of these women, Emma Lee, stated that she saw him enter the alley where Carol was killed at around 1 a.m., before hearing a woman scream. However, she left with a man in a car shortly after, so didn't witness anything else. The second woman, Linda Washington, claimed she saw Leonard leave the alley with his shirt over his arm and a knife in a sheath hanging by his waist. Leonard's defense attorney tried to argue that the witnesses were unreliable and that some of the timings in their stories contradicted one another. He also argued that the robbery charge made no sense regardless, as there was money still in Carol's purse which more than likely had simply been dropped when she was attacked. Regardless of how lacking their case was against him, his arrest did finally bring a sense of relief to the community. But any assumptions that they were now safe were quickly dashed when another victim was discovered on September 6th, while Leonard was still in jail. Michelle Daner, 30, the same woman who had briefly been suspected in the murder of Jean Durkin after arguing with her over a blanket, was found dead in her apartment near Frankford Avenue, having been stabbed 23 times in the chest and stomach. Near to where Carol had been killed, and on the exact same street Teresa was murdered, it seemed clear that she was yet another victim of the same serial killer. Yet the man police claimed to be behind the crimes was sitting behind bars. Like many of the other victims, Michelle suffered from mental health issues and was described as a paranoid loner who was known to act erratically. Like the other victims, she was a regular in many of the bars on Frankford Avenue, and once again, the night before her death, she was seen leaving a bar with an older white man. As you can imagine, her murder raised huge doubts about whether police had arrested the right person. Leonard did not match any of the consistent descriptions of the white man who had been seen with most of the victims before they were killed. Investigators knew they were dealing with a serial killer, but their circumstantial evidence only tied him to a single murder. Leonard, by most accounts, was a mild-mannered and well-liked individual with no criminal record or history of violence, and many people came out in his defense, claiming he had been wrongfully arrested by an inept police force who just wanted to close the case, and had consequently allowed the real killer to remain free to strike again. Despite all this, police remained confident that they had the Frankford Slasher in custody, and claimed that Michelle's murder was likely carried out by a copycat killer. With such unsubstantial evidence against Leonard, this feels like a baffling claim to me. Regardless, on November 29, 1990, Leonard stood trial for the murder of Carol. The jury was never informed that another murder had been committed while Leonard was behind bars, and the information was banned from being discussed in the trial, despite police publicly accusing Leonard of being the Frankford Slasher. Assistant District Attorney Judith Rubino painted Leonard as a ruthless murderer, using a Rambo-style knife to kill Carol Dowd in the alley behind the fish market where he worked. While Rubino acknowledged that there were no direct witnesses to the murder, she argued that circumstantial evidence was enough to prove his guilt. Witnesses had seen Leonard in the alley when Carol was murdered, heard a woman scream, and later saw him carrying a knife, and blood-stained clothing was found at his house. Rubino also pointed to Leonard's lies about his whereabouts on the night of the murder, and other suspicious statements he had made. In his defense, attorney Jack McMahon suggested that the pressure to solve the case had led the police to make a hasty arrest, potentially mistaking the evidence. Despite objections from the prosecution, he argued that there were 6 earlier murders in the area that all pointed to a serial killer, yet his client was only being accused of one of them. Many of the witnesses, he pointed out, were known to be prostitutes and drug users, with extensive criminal records and multiple aliases. One key witness, Emma Lee, had even admitted to lying to the police twice. McMahon also highlighted that when Leonard was arrested, there were no signs of injury on him, and that there was no physical evidence connecting him to the crime scene. No murder weapon had been found, no Rambo knife had surfaced. He urged the jury to question whether there was any real reason to view Leonard as a murderer. Rubino countered McMahon's defense by pointing out some unsettling details that make the whole situation a lot murkier. The morning after Carol's murder, Leonard had casually told his boss, Jasa Fang, that a white woman around 45 years old had been killed in the alley, even though the police had not released that information at the time. Rubino also highlighted a strange remark Christopher had made to Fang just days after the murder, stating, "Maybe I killed her." Though he quickly backpedaled, Fang remembered it vividly. She recalled how he had even mimicked the motion of gutting someone while describing the crime. He also claimed to have seen a white man matching the previous descriptions on the street at 1 a.m., but no other witnesses emerged to back him up. Fang testified that Leonard had been unusually anxious and rambling when he spoke to her about the murder. He claimed to be unable to sleep because he had witnessed it and feared that the white man who knew he had seen the crime might be trying to kill him. Leonard said the man might break into his apartment and hide in his closet. For physical evidence, the prosecution pointed to the tiny bloodstain found in Leonard's home, though admitted it was too small to be conclusively tested. DNA testing was still an emerging field at the time, and the technology wasn't able to analyze such minute traces. However, a blood-stained tissue was found near the building where Leonard lived, and it was identified as type O, the same blood type as Carol's. Leonard, however, had told police that while visiting his girlfriend's apartment, he had seen a well-dressed white man in his 40s outside, wiping his hands on a tissue. The problem was, Leonard hadn't been at his girlfriend's apartment that night, according to her. The trial wrapped up quickly, with closing arguments on December 11th in which the defense stressed Leonard's good character and the lack of a motive, weapon, or solid evidence tying him to the murder, or any of the linked murders. He pointed out that the description of the white man Leonard had given matched earlier witness reports of men seen with all the other victims. McMahon called the prosecution's case garbage, emphasizing that the violence Leonard was accused of was entirely out of character for him. Rubino, however, asked the jury to consider why the witnesses would lie, noting that some were friends of Leonard's, including one who had admitted to originally lying on his behalf to the police. Rubino also pointed out the testimony of witnesses who claimed to have seen Leonard with Carol in a bar the night she was killed, as well as the fact that his girlfriend testified that she did not see him that night, contradicting his claims. On the following day, December 12th, the jury returned a guilty verdict, convicting Leonard of first-degree murder in the death of Carol Dowd. Some jurors, it was reported, appeared visibly shaken by the verdict. Leonard showed no reaction to the verdict, but his defense attorney shook his head in disbelief. While the prosecutor had requested the death penalty, Leonard was instead sentenced to life in prison. He maintained that he had been framed by what he called pipers, prostitutes manipulated by the police. Aside from his strange comment to Fang, he had never confessed to the crime at any other point, and never did even after his conviction. To the majority of investigators nowadays, it seems clear as day that Leonard was not the Frankford Slasher, with police even conceding that while they think he killed Carol, they do not think he killed the other 8 women. Believing he was wrongly convicted in the murder of Carol, the Innocence Project picked up his case, but before they could offer him any real assistance, Leonard sadly died of cancer in prison. So was Leonard Christopher truly the Frankford Slasher, or was he wrongly accused? Even after he was in custody, another body was discovered, yet somehow he wasn't released and cleared of involvement, and the crime was dismissed as a copycat killing for no real reason. Many believe his conviction was driven by racial bias, with the media's sensationalized coverage fueling public pressure to resolve the case quickly. The verdict seemed more about appeasing the public than about true justice. As it stands, the Frankford Slasher case is considered unsolved, even with the conviction of Leonard for Carol's murder. Leonard officially remains a suspect in the other 8 murders, but nearly 30 years later, he has never been tied to any of them, and no solid evidence linking him to the murder of Carol has ever been uncovered. While Leonard's statements to his boss are somewhat compelling evidence against him, it doesn't change the fact that he does not match the suspect seen with nearly every one of the victims prior to their murders, and that there is no direct evidence linking him to the slasher's crimes. No motive, no murder weapon, no DNA, nothing. While it is possible that a copycat was responsible for the murder that occurred while Leonard was in prison, or that not all of the murders are actually connected, it's equally possible that they were all committed by the same individual, and consequently that individual cannot have been Leonard. No new evidence has ever emerged to shed light on the cases, but thankfully, no additional victims have surfaced either. While the Frankford Slasher was likely never caught, we can only hope that whoever was responsible is no longer active. Despite nearly 30 years having passed and the case having faded from the headlines, investigators have recently started to finally revisit the case in the hopes that DNA evidence and advanced forensic techniques might be able to crack it. For one, you'd hope the blood sample taken from Leonard's house could finally be tested with modern techniques to prove once and for all if it was or wasn't Carol's blood. Also, if you remember, I mentioned briefly earlier in the video that police had suspected a middle-aged white man who claimed to be a minister, who vanished after being questioned. Before he disappeared, they actually managed to collect a DNA sample from him, which is now being re-examined using cutting-edge technology. But as the case remains an ongoing investigation, police have refused to discuss it and remained tight-lipped on their progress or any new findings. Attorney Marissa Bluestein from the Innocence Project is still investigating the case, despite Leonard's death, stating, "This is a man who spent the majority of his life in a prison cell for a crime that he did not commit." In a way, that bothered him more than the fact that his freedom had been taken away. Not only was Ms. Dowd never given justice because her murderer was never found and caught, but the other 8 women. Those murders are still unsolved. In October 2023, Raymond Wexel Jr., 51, while in jail accused of killing his neighbor and stabbing 2 inmates at the Blair County Prison, has claimed responsibility for the 9 murders, making the claim that he was the Frankford Slasher. Whether truthful or not, his claims are currently being investigated by the Philadelphia police. But as far as I'm aware, there have been no new announcements since the initial coverage of the situation back in 2023. It's worth pointing out, Wexler would have been a lot younger at the time than the suspects seen with many of the victims. The victims of the Frankford Slasher are part of a broader pattern where marginalized women are especially vulnerable to violence, including murder, in the United States. Most of the women targeted in this case were known to frequent areas notorious for drug activity, and many were suspected to have drug addictions, with some even potentially being involved in sex work. The truth about the Frankford Slasher may never be known. What is clear is that the case, filled with unanswered questions and lingering doubts, remains a haunting chapter in Philadelphia's history. And with that, our exploration of this disturbing case comes to a close. So what do you think about this one? Do you think the murders were all committed by the same serial killer? Do you think Leonard was guilty of killing Carol, or even all of the victims? Or in contrast, do you think he was wrongfully convicted? Was he racially targeted and used as a scapegoat by law enforcement? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments section below. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, and consider checking out my new Patreon if you want to support me further. You have been watching The Mystery Abyss. August 9th, 1987. A dense heat fills the air of Philadelphia, a storm on the verge of breaking. Harrison Graham, a mentally impaired 28-year-old, known to local children as the eccentric man who carries a Cookie Monster puppet around with him everywhere he goes, holding conversations with it using a creepy impersonation of the character's distinct voice, is evicted from his small apartment in a dilapidated row house. After neighbors complained of the horrific smell coming from his apartment, Harrison had refused his landlord access to find out what was going on, resulting in his eviction. As his landlord's son and nephew arrive to carry out the eviction, Harrison nails a door shut in the apartment, before fleeing down the fire escape with a handful of clothes, a bottle of water, and his beloved Cookie Monster puppet. Unable to enter the apartment to find out what was causing the unbearable smell, the police are contacted to break the door down and investigate. Local police were already on high alert, having recently discovered and arrested a brutal serial killer, Gary Heidnik, living only a few miles away from the address. Simultaneously, the investigation into the brutal and unsolved case of the Frankford Slasher, a serial killer who had been hunting in the exact same area of Philadelphia, was in full swing, which you can learn more about in my deep dive into the case linked below. I highly recommend watching that video first if you haven't done yet, as it will provide some interesting context and background that will add a lot to this video. Harrison had previously been seen digging graves he claimed were for dogs, and was known to hang around with drug dealers and users. But despite this, and despite his weird and eccentric ways, no one suspected he was harboring the dark and twisted secret that he was. Because Harrison was a serial killer. And the smell his neighbors had complained about was actually coming from the many rotten corpses hidden in his apartment. This is the shocking story of Officer Pete Scalatino was well acquainted with the neighborhood where Harrison lived, a neighborhood of tenements that were mostly boarded up, abandoned, and in total disrepair. While it might not have looked like the sort of place anyone would live, this desolate neighborhood was home to those on the fringes of society. drug addicts, the homeless, the desperate. Police were frequently called to the area to deal with drug dealers, pimps, and cases of domestic violence. Arriving at 1631 North 19th Street, Officer Scalatino found the front door to the building was broken open and covered in rubble, with windows shattered throughout the hallways inside. Making his way up to the third floor, he was instantly struck by the unmistakable stench of death, exacerbated by the hot and humid weather. It was a smell he was all too familiar with, and he had no doubt he was about to find a body. With no working electricity and most of the windows boarded up, Officer Scalatino struggled to see what he was looking at as he approached Harrison's dark apartment at the end of the hallway. As he entered, he was shocked to find waist-high piles of trash in the darkness, with food containers, rotting newspapers, and piles of dirty clothes and dried feces scattered throughout the room. On the wall, a disturbing drawing of a naked woman was defaced with crude, abusive language, smeared with what appeared to be dried blood. Approaching the room that had been boarded shut, Officer Scalatino was sure the cause of the foul odor lay behind it. The name Marty was carved into the door, with an open keyhole beneath it. Scalatino tried and failed to open it, causing him to kneel down and peer into the keyhole. Through the opening, he saw what looked to be the legs of a black woman, lying unnaturally still. Was she the source of the stench? After knocking and trying to get her attention with no response, Scalatino called for backup and was quickly joined by Charles Johnson, an investigator with the medical examiner's office. Together, Officer Scalatino and Investigator Johnson forced open the door, breaking through the nailed boards. As soon as it swung open, they were struck by such a strong and overpowering smell that they struggled not to instantly vomit. Like the rest of the apartment, the room was completely covered with trash. Lying on a mattress on the floor, now fully visible, there was no doubt that the woman seen through the keyhole was dead. She was bloated and discolored from decomposition, with her limbs twisted and contorted. Next to the mattress, there lied another bloated female body on top of a pile of trash, dressed in a miniskirt and a shirt with the words "Pour toi" and a red rose on it. Officer Scalatino quickly set up yellow crime scene tape around the apartment and in the hallway as he called for backup, unsure exactly what he'd just discovered. Because drug overdoses were extremely common in the area, he knew it was possible that the two women had simply died and been left to decay. But something about the whole situation led him to believe this wasn't just another overdose case, that this wasn't just another decrepit drug den. He suspected he had stumbled upon something much, much worse. And unfortunately, his instincts were about to be proven right. Detective James Hansen, who had just wrapped up the Heidnik investigation, was sent to the scene to see what he made of it. Donning masks to protect themselves from the overwhelming filth, by 3:45 p.m., the detective and his team had discovered the remains of a third woman. Having been wrapped inside 2 sheets and buried beneath the trash under the second body, this woman was practically skeletal, with only a few fragments of her clothing left to potentially help identify her. The state of her remains strongly suggested that the grim happenings at 1631 North Street had been ongoing for quite some time. Needing space to move and photograph the 3 bodies, the team had no choice but to start clearing the mess, and were forced to start chucking furniture, clothing, and garbage out of the window. Less than 2 hours later, a 4th set of mummified remains was discovered, wrapped in sheets and buried beneath the rotten trash. Detective Hansen was quoted saying, "This is the first time, to my knowledge, that we found 4 bodies of suspicious death in the same house." It seemed to the detective that one room had been used by Harrison to live in, and the other room had been turned into some sort of private mausoleum. With 4 bodies now discovered in the small, cluttered apartment, and no doubts that this was not a simple overdose case, more officers, including the medical examiner Robert L. Catherman himself, were called in to help with the investigation. As thunder rumbled outside from the breaking storm, more lighting was brought in to allow the forensic team to sift through the endless piles of trash for any clues or evidence. By 5:30 p.m., a 5th body was discovered wedged between the 2 mattresses on the bed, where it had clearly been for a long time, having decomposed to the point where gender could no longer be determined. It appeared as though Harrison had been sleeping on the top mattress, with this decomposed corpse directly beneath him, like a dried flower pressed between the pages of a book. As more and more muck and debris was cleared, an officer called out after discovering a 6th body crammed into a tiny 6-inch deep closet, wrapped in a sheet and bound with white electrical cord, buried beneath garbage and tattered clothing. Eventually, with the sun gone and rain falling, the already difficult search had become even more uncomfortable, and with 6 bodies found, the operation was suspended until morning. Despite the rain, rumors of the discovery of the bodies spread through the neighborhood, leading local residents and reporters to gather outside and watch as body bag after body bag was carried out of the building by officers wearing masks. With the bodies taken to the morgue to be properly examined, it seemed clear to the detectives that they had just stumbled across the graveyard of yet another serial killer. Despite living so close to Heidnik, it seemed unlikely that Harrison had anything to do with his similar murder spree. Yet investigators couldn't help but wonder if they'd just found the home of the Frankford Slasher. When the search resumed at dawn the next day, it expanded to outside the apartment, and it didn't take long for a seventh victim to be discovered. Unlike the other bodies, this one was found dismembered on the roof of the building, inside a decaying canvas bag hidden beneath a stained mattress. There was no head or torso with the remains, with locals telling them that Harrison had been seen digging in the backyard and on vacant lots across the street on numerous occasions. The team began preparing to dig in the hopes of locating more bodies. A photo of Harrison was printed in the local newspapers that morning, while patrol officers hit the streets in search of information. The manhunt for this disturbed serial killer had begun. A warrant for Harrison's arrest was quickly issued. Because detectives were yet to determine the cause of death of the decomposed bodies in his apartment, they charged him with multiple accounts of abusing a corpse. At the very least, they knew for a fact that Harrison had been living with the dead bodies in his apartment. Harrison, who liked to go by the name that had been found on the door to his tomb of horrors, Marty, had been living in the rundown building for more than 4 years, and was a familiar face in the neighborhood. In part due to his role as a handyman, with many reporting that he often seemed quiet and friendly. However, they also learned that he had a reputation for dealing drugs, and that his apartment was a known drug den where users went to shoot up. Speaking to one of his neighbors, they discovered that Harrison kept notebooks filled with crude drawings of naked women and dismembered body parts, including breasts, feet, heads, and male genitalia. The same neighbor even told them that they had once witnessed Harrison dangling a woman out of his window, causing her to scream before he quickly pulled her back inside. The detectives discovered that Harrison was known to frequent a few specific areas where he had friends and family, so assumed he may have fled to one of these locations. But their searches failed to find any sign of his presence. Police did manage to locate his mother, Lillian Graham Jeter, who was only 45, meaning that she had given birth to 28-year-old Harrison when she was just 17 years old. He was the oldest of 5 children. According to Lillian, she had had no choice but to kick him out of her home in 1979 due to his heavy drug use. However, she did share one important detail with them. A few months earlier, Harrison had told her that his girlfriend, Mary, was pregnant, before informing her that the baby had died sometime before July 4th when she saw him. She also informed them that he was classified as learning disabled, and that he had been diagnosed with a mental disorder at 12, leading to him being hospitalized for 2 years, and that he had spent time in foster care. Investigators were never able to confirm whether he had actually received an official diagnosis like she claimed. It became apparent that his developmental issues had made it difficult for him to form meaningful relationships in his youth, and by the time he reached adulthood, Harrison had developed a nasty crack cocaine addiction, which only exacerbated his troubles. After leaving his mother's house, he began drinking heavily and associating with pimps, sex workers, and drug dealers in the rough neighborhood he moved to. During this time, he acquired his prized possession, a Cookie Monster doll, which he became deeply attached to and took with him everywhere he went. Locals informed them that Harrison was often seen taking long walks with the puppet, which he would use to entertain neighborhood kids. While some saw this as harmless, others told the police that he seemed crazy, especially when he drank and could be seen doing things like dancing in the streets or talking to his puppet alone. While none of these neighbors reported seeing Harrison engage in any violent behavior, and he had no criminal record, it wouldn't be long before a number of women would emerge claiming that he had physically attacked and sexually assaulted them. In the morgue, the medical examiner's team began trying to identify the victims and to determine their causes of death. DNA science was still in its infancy at the time and was not commonly used to identify victims yet. The first 2 victims, both black women, appeared to have only been dead for a couple of days, with the intense summer heat causing them to rapidly decompose. Both were likely in their late 20s or early 30s, and neither initially showed any obvious signs of violence or trauma. The other bodies were in such bad states that their race and sex couldn't even be identified. As a result, an anthropologist was called to help analyze their bone structures. Eventually, they were able to confirm that 2 more of the bodies belonged to black women in their 20s, and that the remains found on the roof also belonged to a woman. Despite initially struggling to find a cause of death, a broken hyoid bone on the 4th victim was eventually discovered, implying that they had been strangled, and by August 11th, it was confirmed that the two most recent victims had also been strangled to death. Their times of death were also extended to have been sometime in the past 10 days. With at least 3 victims confirmed to have been murdered, there was now no doubt in anyone's mind that they were dealing with a serial killer, and that they needed to find Harrison quickly before he had the chance to hurt anyone else. The media reports about a madman on the loose kept the public engaged. After hearing about the discovery of the bodies on the news, a woman came forward stating that she believed her roommate Sandra Garvin, who had been missing for several months, might have been one of the victims. She had gone to buy drugs from Harrison, but had never returned. Before long, police learned the identities of 3 more women who were all known to have connections to Harrison and were all missing. 2 of these women were ultimately found alive, and as a result, they were removed from the list of potential victims and placed on the list of potential witnesses, with one of them having lived with Harrison without incident. Another neighbor reported to the police that she had witnessed Harrison beating a woman called Robin Deschazor, leading them to suspect that she could be one of the victims. Meanwhile, the husband of Mary Jeter Mathis contacted the police, recognizing the shirt found with the second body as one he had purchased for his wife. While tips on potential identities of the victims were pouring in, so were sightings of Harrison, thanks to his photo being shown on the news. On August 11th, there were sightings of him on Broad Street, riding a SEPTA bus, at a soup kitchen, and at a car wash. Although these sightings were all deemed credible, police failed to arrive in time to make an arrest at any of the locations. Another witness claimed to see Harrison getting a meal at the Cathedral of Deliverance Evangelistic Church, describing him as looking vacant and glassy-eyed. In this instance, police arrived at the scene moments after the sighting, confirming his identity with the picture to witnesses, yet once again he managed to evade them. Simultaneously, the building on North 19th Street where Harrison had lived was condemned due to multiple code violations, leading to all of the remaining tenants being forced to vacate. This made it slightly easier for the crime scene investigators, who were busy sifting through the piles of trash and debris inside Harrison's apartment, to continue their search for evidence. Among the mess, they discovered 2 earrings near the mummified remains of the 3rd victim, and a ring and 3rd earring alongside one of the other bodies, both of which had distinctive designs. Police released details of the finds, hoping somebody might recognize them as belonging to somebody. In the hopes of helping confirm the identities of the victims, forensic dentist Haskell Askin was called in. Of the 6 complete sets of remains discovered, 5 of them had undergone some form of dental work, so Askin put out a plea to the public for anyone who feared their loved one may be among the victims to provide him with dental records for comparison. Meanwhile, investigators continued their search of the condemned building and its surroundings. The officers digging up the garden discovered more bones buried where Harrison had previously been seen digging. However, just as he had claimed, they turned out to belong to dogs. Struggling to locate Harrison, his mother and siblings issued a public plea for him to surrender himself to the police, though they did not believe he was responsible for the deaths. One of his younger brothers claimed he was so afraid of bodies he couldn't even attend their grandmother's funeral, so there was no way he could have been living and sleeping in a room with corpses. Then, 6 days after the initial discovery on August 15th, another chilling find was made. In the basement of a building a couple of doors down from Harrison's apartment, a human torso and skull were discovered wrapped in a brown blanket and tied with electrical cord. Given it clearly mirrored how the other bodies had been stored in Harrison's apartment, it was assumed this was yet another victim of his. However, these remains were found partially covered by a pile of coal ashes, suggesting that other remains had been burnt and left there too. Were they from the same victim, or did they belong to someone else entirely? The 7th victim discovered on the roof was missing these specific body parts, so it was also unclear if the remains belonged to the same person or an 8th, new victim. By the time these remains had been discovered, the medical examiner's office had been able to confirm that 6 of the victims were black women and had formally identified 36-year-old mother of 5 Mary Jeter Mathis, whose husband had recognized her clothing, as one of them. Then, 2 days later on August 17th, Harrison's mother Lillian received a call from her son that would change everything. Harrison, tired and hungry, asked if she could bring him some food, explaining that he wanted to meet with her. As they spoke, Lillian remarked, "Stop running, son. Whatever happened, we can work this out. Just come on home. We love you. Your family loves you." Miraculously, her words seemed to have an effect on him. She arranged to meet him on a street corner a few blocks from his apartment, where officers Ed Spangler and Larry Brzezicki arrived to take him into custody. By evening, Harrison was charged with 7 counts of abuse of a corpse and 7 counts of murder. Initially, Harrison told Detective Hansen and the investigators questioning him that the bodies had been in the apartment when he moved in 4 years ago, and that he hadn't killed anyone, despite evidence showing that at least 2 of the victims had been killed less than 10 days before he was evicted. After hours of interrogation, however, with Detective Hansen pushing him relentlessly, Harrison's story changed. Initially, he admitted to having killed the 2 most recent victims. But by the next evening, he had changed his story and claimed that he had killed all 7 women, but that their deaths had occurred while he was high and having sex with them. Even more disturbingly, he claimed that while his hands had done the killing, he wasn't responsible. According to Harrison, it was Marty, a split personality he claimed was living inside of him. As he began opening up, he revealed that all of the victims had been killed that year, with the first murder occurring back in January. According to him, it just started happening, and once he had begun, he found that Marty was unable to stop. The first murder he described to them was of a former girlfriend, Robin Deschazor, with forensics confirming the remains on the roof and in the nearby basement belonging to her. He was quoted as saying, "She knew about Marty and his desires. I didn't want her looking at me that way, and I seen God being angry through her eyes." He admitted that after killing Robin, he was so shaken and terrified by what he had done that he left her body in his apartment. It wasn't until he brought another woman there that he tried to conceal the body by lifting it through the bedroom window onto the roof. He even claimed that he ended up telling a girlfriend about the body and even showed it to her. According to him, she threatened to report him to the police unless he got rid of it, resulting in him relocating her head and torso to the nearby building it was found in, leaving a handful of her remains in a hidden bag on the roof. According to Harrison, he lured all his victims, whether acquaintances or strangers, by offering them drugs. What began as consensual sex would always end in strangulation. Each time, Harrison said he was shocked when he woke up to find his victim dead beside him, claiming to be remorseful for the crimes his split personality committed. He identified a number of the victims, and with the help of family members, 6 of the 7 victims were identified as Robin Deschazor, 29, Mary Jeter Mathis, 36, Sandra Garvin, 33, Cynthia Brooks, 27, Barbara Mahoney, 22, and Patricia Franklin, 24. Throughout the interrogation, Harrison sketched faces of his victims with surprising artistic skill. The detectives, who had expected the mentally disabled man to struggle to communicate, were actually surprised by just how talented and articulate he was. It even turned out he was not as illiterate as had been claimed and was an avid reader of the Bible. Ultimately, Harrison provided a 10-page confession letter that detailed every one of the murders. In it, he repeatedly insisted that the deaths were all accidents and that they had all died while being choked during sex. Despite Harrison having confessed to murdering 7 women, giving investigators in the ongoing Frankford Slasher case reason to suspect his involvement, none of the victims had been stabbed or assaulted like those of the slasher. Furthermore, at the time, police were looking for a middle-aged white man in that case, not a relatively young, tall black man. So it didn't take long for them to view Harrison as a separate killer. Ironically, the same detectives would go on to accuse a different black man, Leonard Christopher, of being the slasher based on almost no evidence. Regardless, establishing Harrison as a different serial killer meant that at the exact same time he was committing his murders, Heidnik had been murdering women a couple of miles away from him, and the slasher had been killing in the same general area of Philadelphia. All 3 cases, as shocking as it seemed to detectives, appeared to be completely unrelated to one another. While being held without bail in solitary confinement, Harrison was appointed a public defender, Joel Moldovsky, to represent him. Moldovsky discovered that Harrison had been handcuffed to a chair for hours during his interrogation, and hadn't even realized he could request legal counsel, although his mother had been present during questioning. Moldovsky immediately questioned whether Harrison was capable of signing his confession, or if the confession, which could also serve as his death certificate, was lawful. While detectives insisted the confession was valid and procedurally sound, Moldovsky argued that Harrison's due process rights had been violated. On August 25th, an anonymous former girlfriend of Harrison's wrote an account in the Daily News, recalling that in January he had confessed to her that he had killed another girlfriend and thrown her out of the window. When Harrison was out, she went out onto the roof to discover a skeleton beneath an old, worn mattress. She claimed that when she finally left him a while later, she told the police about the body, but that they ignored her and didn't even go and check if she was telling the truth. She claimed to suffer from severe nightmares about Harrison's hands around her throat, considering herself lucky to have not been one of his victims. In trying to determine if there's any truth to Harrison's claims about having a split personality called Marty, It was important for the investigators to look further into his background. Using information he openly offered to them and what they were able to gather themselves, it seemed clear that he had had a difficult childhood. As a young boy, struggling to form relationships, he spent much of his time on the streets, where he claimed he finally felt deeply loved for the first time, and got himself entangled with a male pimp as both a lover and an employee. Introduced to prostitution, drugs, and what must have been a very confusing homosexual relationship at a young age, his mother was eventually able to pull him away from the streets. While it's not clear when Harrison transitioned into becoming a serial killer, some psychologists have claimed that the conflict between being a loving Christian son and a homosexual drug addict who embraced the darker side of street life could have created an internal division. If true, this division would then eventually manifest itself in the creation of a separate identity, Marty, who Harrison could blame for his actions, leaving him free from guilt, shame, or responsibility. That said, despite seeming to single Marty out as a darker personality in his initial comments, Harrison would later go on to claim that Marty was actually his good personality, the friendly handyman everybody knew and loved. Whereas, according to him, he had two other personalities. One was called Junior, and was a childlike, Christian heterosexual who loved his mother. And one was called Frank, who was a homosexual, streetwise drug addict, who was responsible for the murders. Supposedly, Frank viewed homosexuality and drug use as sinful, and held a strong hatred and resentment towards women. Unless I've misunderstood his varied statements made after his arrest and throughout his trial, it comes across to me that while Harrison clearly had mental troubles, the concept of genuine alternate personalities living inside of him was most likely made up as a means to try and evade punishment for his crimes. To try and identify the final known victim, detectives enlisted the help of forensic sculptor Frank Bender, who we've spoken about numerous times before, such as during his instrumental role in helping capture family annihilator John List. Bender was a renowned sculptor who frequently worked with law enforcement to create lifelike busts and age-progressed reconstructions of fugitives and victims, resulting in numerous cases being solved and victims being identified. The victim's distinctive elongated face, with a pointed chin and asymmetrical nose, made her stand out as an individual. Bender added a plausible hairstyle to his bust and took photographs for the newspapers, hoping someone would recognize her. An older couple came forward after seeing the image, believing it could be their 25-year-old daughter, Valerie Jameson, who had been missing for 6 months. Comparing her medical records to the remains, a unique rib feature was used to confirm her identity, alongside personal items found with the remains, including earrings identical to those she was known to wear. Detectives now knew the identities of all 7 of the victims. Harrison's pre-trial hearing began with a chilling account from detectives about their findings throughout the investigation. Harrison reportedly rocked back and forth in an agitated state as he listened to detectives discussing his crimes and directly quoting from his confession about how he murdered the 7 women and the disturbing things he did with their bodies. Harrison's defense attorney, Moldovsky, contrastingly drew on a number of experts to make the claim that he was not mentally competent to stand trial. One of these experts, psychologist Dr. Stanton, claimed that after evaluating Harrison, his IQ was determined to be 63, which is below the threshold for mental competence. Coupled with his severe substance abuse and addiction issues, he claimed that Harrison's mental state was severely impaired. According to Dr. Stanton, Harrison also suffered from hallucinations, psychosis, blackouts, and chronic paranoia. Another psychologist, Albert Levitt, testified that Harrison lacked fundamental academic skills such as reading, writing, math, and telling time. Despite this, Judge Edward McKell, relying on the detectives and the district attorney's expert Dr. Robert Sardoff, who all believed Harrison was competent and coherent during his interrogation and confession, declared that he was fit to stand trial. On October 6th, Harrison entered a not guilty plea. When questioned if he understood what was going on by the judge, he simply responded, "Nope." He even claimed he didn't know where he was and that he just wanted to go home. The assistant district attorney suggested that Harrison was pretending to be confused, and the judge, accepting the not guilty plea, echoed the idea, believing Harrison was making up the alternate personalities to try and absolve himself of responsibility for what he'd done. In contrast, his mother Lillian remained adamant that her son was incapable of committing the heinous acts he was accused of and had confessed to, arguing that even under the influence of drugs or alcohol, it was impossible for him to have hurt anyone, or to have lived surrounded by corpses. After 5 more court-appointed experts evaluated him, Harrison was once again deemed fit to stand trial, with them all finding him calm, alert, and cooperative. Though they did identify personality disorders, none of them believed these would make him incapable of standing trial. In early February, a 2-hour hearing took place to decide which pieces of the prosecution's evidence would be allowed. Over 100 graphic photos of the apartment were introduced as evidence. Upon seeing them, Harrison dismissed them as the actions of a very sick person, and was even seen chuckling at the images. Charles Johnson, the medical examiner's investigator, took the stand and described the discovery of each of the 7 bodies. He presented the photographs as slides on poster boards, with Judge Robert Latrone even stepping down from the bench to examine them closely. The hearing was extremely heated, with the prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Roger King, and Harrison's lawyer Moldovsky frequently clashing and accusing each other of misconduct. With Harrison himself shouting out too, deputies were forced to de-escalate the situation on multiple occasions, as Judge Latrone tried to quell the hostility between the two sides. Moldovsky tried to argue that murder was not consistent with Harrison's nature, and that he had been framed for the deaths of the 7 women who had either overdosed or been murdered by others in the apartment. According to Moldovsky, Harrison had only confessed because he had the mental age of a 9-year-old, and police had provided him with details that aligned with their findings to tell them. There was some debate as to whether Harrison's confession to 4 of the murders would be dismissed, as he had only confessed to them during a second round of questioning by Detective Hansen where he had not been reread his rights. However, Judge Latrone ultimately allowed the entire confession, along with the graphic crime scene photos, to all be used as evidence. As jury selection began for a trial set for March 4th, the prosecutor announced they would be seeking the death penalty. On March 8th, Harrison chose to waive his right to a jury trial, opting instead for a bench trial where the judge would make the final decision. His lawyer and mother convinced him that a jury might be swayed by the disturbing evidence, making it harder to remain objective. Given that Judge Latrone had already been exposed to much of the evidence, the trial was expected to proceed much more quickly than originally anticipated. At his trial, after presenting all of the evidence, the prosecution introduced a surprise witness called Paula. According to Paula, she had lived with Harrison, and he had regularly strangled her during sex, sometimes causing her to pass out. In the 3 years she was with him, Paula claimed that Harrison told her that he strangled Robin de Chazor to death because she was going to leave him. Paula further claimed that Harrison had admitted to practicing necrophilia with the corpse, which triggered an outburst from him, during which he accused her of lying. Fearing he would do the same to her if she left him, Paula claimed she felt trapped and unable to leave, causing her to endure sexual assault, beatings, and torture at his hands. While her testimony was intended to cement Harrison's conviction, the defense quickly jumped on her claim that Harrison had strangled Robin. While he had strangled a number of his victims, the evidence had implied that he had beaten Robin to death rather than strangled her, which cast doubt on the credibility of Paula's testimony. They also questioned if she was telling the truth at all, as there was no other evidence that Harrison had been able to maintain long-term relationships. 2 days later, Mary Hogan, the woman who had anonymously told her story to the press before, took the stand to share her experience of living with Harrison. She testified that they had sex multiple times a day, and during some of their encounters he tried to strangle her. Mary also described seeing the body of Robin de Chazor on the roof, indicating that the corpse had been there since before October 1986, much earlier than Harrison had stated in his confession. To escape with her belongings, she had to seek police help, as Harrison had threatened to kill her with a machete and locked her in the apartment. Mary claimed she did inform an officer about the body on the roof, but he didn't believe her, and never investigated it. She also described how Harrison spoke daily to his Cookie Monster puppet, before declaring that she had never loved him, and had never been pregnant as he had believed. Hearing her words, Harrison charged her, pushing past 2 deputies before he was restrained. Moldovsky later claimed his response stemmed from anger upon realizing that she had lied to him about the pregnancy, and was not an indication of him having a violent nature. Another witness, one of Harrison's drug addict associates, claimed to have witnessed him strangling 2 women, as well as having seen Mary Mathis's body on the bed in the apartment with a terrible smell. However, his testimony was dismissed when it was revealed he had been paid for his statements and had previously been found incompetent to stand trial in his own legal case. Throughout the trial, Harrison was noted as behaving strangely. At one point, he brought 4 monkey puppets into the courtroom, playing with them while his defense argued his case. In another instance, he was seen giggling when the leg bones found in the bag on the roof were being discussed. His demeanor was even said to be bouncy and upbeat. In his closing arguments, Moldovsky proposed that either the women had overdosed, that someone else was responsible for their deaths, pointing fingers at the landlord and his relatives who had been the first people at the crime scene, or that Harrison was psychotic and high to the point that he may have accidentally strangled the women. In response, the assistant district attorney sarcastically remarked, "Toto, we're no longer in Kansas," calling the idea that anyone could accidentally strangle 7 women laughable. In his view, Harrison was a serial killer, plain and simple. By waiving his right to a jury, Harrison's fate was left solely in the hands of Judge Latrone. Unsurprisingly, Latrone found him guilty of first-degree murder and abuse of a corpse for all charges. As the verdict was read, Harrison sat up, blinked his eyes, and shook his head, before remarking, "Everything will work out just fine," and asking if they could give him his Cookie Monster puppet back as it was no longer needed as evidence. Moldovsky later told reporters, "I assume he knows he was found guilty, but I'm not sure." After hearing the verdict, Camelia de Chazor, the mother of victim Robin de Chazor, wept outside the courtroom, stating, "I guess justice was done. I still hate him." When a reporter asked her if Harrison should receive the death penalty, she coldly responded with, "He deserves anything he gets." Leroy Artisan, the father of Sandra Garvin, told reporters, "I wouldn't say she's resting easy, but I would hope. This has been one of the most excruciating phases of my life, just having to go there and sitting through it. I guess time heals all things." Harrison's mother claimed that he had been wrongfully convicted, and that the landlord and his family were the true killers, and had successfully pinned it on her mentally incompetent son. In contrast, Harrison laughed and even signed autographs, claiming he wasn't concerned about the verdict. Assistant District Attorney King, while happy with the outcome of the trial, told reporters, "At this point, I can only say that the books might not be closed. There might be other victims." In May of 1988, Judge Latrone sentenced Harrison to 6 consecutive terms of 7 to 14 years, 6 death sentences, and 1 life sentence. In a surprising move, Latrone stated that Harrison would not be executed until after serving his life sentence. Moldovsky, his defense attorney, called the decision compassionate, as it meant that Harrison would effectively serve a life sentence without the possibility of parole and not be executed. Latrone cited Harrison's severe neglect during childhood and his lack of prior criminal convictions as mitigating factors. The single life sentence was for the murder of Robin de Chazor, the first victim, as there were no other murders to provide aggravating circumstances. While some criticized his compassion, it was evident that Harrison had endured unimaginable hardships as a child, which may have contributed to his later psychological issues and the development of alternate personalities, if his claims are to be believed. This unprecedented sentence essentially eliminated Moldovsky's plan to appeal, as he didn't want to risk a decision that might worsen the situation for his client who had essentially avoided being executed. However, in 1994, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court unanimously ruled that the death sentence must be carried out, putting Harrison at immediate risk of execution. The execution was scheduled for December 7th, but Judge Latrone delayed it. The U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear the case, and the execution date was rescheduled for August 1996. However, further delays pushed the case into 2002 when the U.S. Supreme Court banned the execution of what it called the mentally retarded. Harrison's legal team worked to prove that he met this standard. One psychiatrist noted that although Harrison's IQ was below 70, he didn't meet the criteria because he was able to function beyond his test scores. Finally, on December 20, 2003, 17 years after his original sentencing, Harrison was deemed incompetent to be executed. His death sentence was vacated and his life sentence was reinstated. He is now 65 years old, and after studying religion and being ordained, serves as a minister from behind bars, often referred to as Philadelphia's corpse collector, or as the Cookie Monster Killer. Harrison's case is a difficult one to fully comprehend. While there seems to be no real doubt that he was responsible for the deaths of the 7 women he was convicted of killing, whether he truly understood what he was doing or the gravity of his actions is less clear. Whatever the truth of it, Harrison's tragic upbringing and dire circumstances clearly contributed to his twisted mental state. Even if he did know and understand what he was doing was wrong, he clearly was severely mentally ill. He did, after all, spend all his time talking to a Cookie Monster puppet, whether he had multiple personalities or not. And with that, our exploration of this strange case comes to a close. I've begun calling the serial killer trio of Harrison, Heidnik, and the Frankford Slasher the Philly Three as I've been researching them. I still find it difficult to comprehend that these 3 distinct serial killers were hunting and murdering in each other's backyards at the exact same time, while I don't personally believe their actions had any connection to one another. beyond perhaps the economic and societal situation at the time creating an environment ripe for people like them to abuse. I actually find the notion that they were acting independently more chilling. Somebody pointed out to me on the Frankford Slasher video that it feels more like something from the world of Dexter, and I'm inclined to agree. It always feels far-fetched in stories like Dexter that there are so many serial killers active in the same city at the same time, but these cases make it frighteningly clear that it's entirely possible. Given, I imagine, many of the worst monsters go unnoticed, killing in the shadows, I find it really unsettling to imagine just how many serial killers are walking among us right now. And on that cheery note, I'm going to end the video. If you found this deep dive interesting, please like and subscribe and drop a comment down below to appease the algorithm gods. I'll be looking to have a video on Heidnik up soon to complete my trilogy on the Philly 3. So if that's something you're interested in seeing, make sure to keep an eye out for it. You have been watching The Mystery Abyss. March 24th, 1987. Vincent Nelson opens the door to his Philadelphia apartment to see his girlfriend, Josefina Rivera, who has been missing since the previous November. Before he can say anything, she rushes inside, desperate and terrified, and begins explaining where she's been for the last 4 months. But the story she tells him is by far the most harrowing thing he's ever heard, as she details how she was abducted, tortured, and sexually abused by a religious figurehead called Gary Heidnik. With disturbing details such as being kept captive in a deep pit dug in the basement and being force-fed body parts of other women he had killed. Vincent struggles to believe what he's hearing. Josefina, it seems, had managed to escape by gaining Gary's trust enough that he was happy to drop her off to visit family, with the expectation that she would return to him with a new wife to join the other women he was holding captive. She was supposed to meet him at a nearby gas station at midnight. With Vincent still not believing her, Josefina leaves the apartment and runs to the nearest payphone to call the police. Officers John Cannon and David Savage arrive at the apartment within minutes, listening skeptically as Josefina recounts her ordeal once again. If she is to be believed, Gary has kidnapped 6 women in the last 4 months, including herself. 3 are still being held captive in his basement, with the other 2 having already been murdered. Though they struggle to believe her story is actually true, their doubts are silenced when Josefina lifts her jeans up to reveal deep scars around her ankles where her chains had been. And to add to it, this was right as the manhunt for the Frankford Slasher, a brutal serial killer targeting women in the same area, was in full swing. And the actions of the depraved killer Josefina was describing meant they couldn't help but ask, was this Gary the wanted serial killer they'd been searching for? So the 2 officers decide to head to the gas station where Gary is supposedly waiting in his Cadillac. Spotting the vehicle immediately, they approach with their guns drawn, causing Gary to raise his hands and question if they're here about his child support. Confused, they tell him that they're here about something much, much worse, wasting no time arresting him. With Gary in custody, homicide detective James Hansen and a team of officers, including Officer Savage, who made the arrest, head over to his home on 3520 North Marshall Street, breaking down the heavily secured door. Following the instructions Josefina had given him, Officer Savage heads straight for the basement. As soon as he enters it, he sees 2 black women lying asleep on a mattress under a dirty blanket. Both women are chained to a ceiling pipe and dressed in nothing but a thin blouse and socks. Later identified as Jacqueline Askins and Lisa Thomas, the 2 terrified women quickly point to a plywood sheet on the floor covered with bags of soil. Moving the bags and the plywood, the officer discovers a nude woman, Agnes Adams, crouching in a hidden pit below. Hurrying to remove the chains from the 3 women, they're taken out of the house to a waiting ambulance to treat their injuries. With the women safe, and Josefina's story confirmed to be entirely true, the police begin searching the house for evidence of the other horrors she had told them about. In the kitchen, a pot on the stove is found with a yellowish, fatty substance inside, next to an industrial food processor used for raw meat. In the oven, Officer Savage discovers a dish with a charred piece of bone that looks unsettlingly like a human rib. Any doubts as to whether these are human remains are silenced when the officers open the fridge to discover a human forearm in the freezer compartment. This is Gary Heidnik's House of Horrors. It would ultimately turn out that Gary's twisted crimes were unrelated to those of the Frankford Slasher, and it wouldn't be long before a 3rd serial killer, Harrison Graham, would be arrested after killing multiple women in his own apartment, only a couple of miles away too. If you want to find out more about either of those cases, I've linked my videos on them down below, with this exploration into Gary being the final video in my series of what I'm calling the Philly Three. Three violent serial killers, who all committed similar murder sprees at the exact same time in more or less the exact same area of Philadelphia. If you're already thinking that elements of this case sound similar to the crimes of Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs, you'd be right in thinking so, as Gary was one of the key inspirations for Thomas Harris's infamous serial killer. Gary subjected his victims to unimaginable horrors, forcing them into sexual slavery, torturing them and coercing them to torture one another, and even forcing them to consume the remains of the victims he murdered. An Army veteran with an IQ of 148, in charge of a religious group he founded with 50 members called the United Church of the Ministers of God, and wealth that far exceeded what was typical in his neighborhood due to savvy investments. Gary was seen as a little eccentric to the outside world, but nobody ever thought he was capable of the monstrous crimes he was committing in the privacy of his home. In fact, his congregation saw him as a respected and charismatic leader, gathering weekly in his home to hear his unconventional interpretations of the Bible, seemingly oblivious to the fact that 6 women were being kept chained in a pit in the basement just below their feet. Some have claimed that Gary's actions stemmed from severe mental illness, while others claim he was motivated by nothing more than pure malice. But according to Josephina, Gary's actions had an entirely different motive, with her claiming he told her, "I want to have kids, lots of them. I got kids already, but the state keeps taking them off me. Well, I got a way now of having kids so nobody can take them away. You're just the start. You're gonna have my baby down here, but not just you. I want to get 10 girls down here so you can all have my kids." While we've covered some dark and unsettling cases recently on the channel, it's worth stating up front that this is a particularly nasty one, by a particularly cruel and depraved psychopath. So be warned, this video isn't for the faint of heart. Without further ado, this is the story of On November 26, 1986, 25-year-old sex worker Josefina Rivera left her apartment in an impoverished neighborhood of North Philadelphia looking for work. Walking the streets in search of a John, she was hoping to earn enough money to provide her 3 estranged children with a meal on Thanksgiving in a couple of days' time. Walking in the rain and icy wind for hours in the dark with no customers, she was about to call it quits for the night when a Cadillac slowly rolled past her and came to a stop. As she approached the vehicle, the window lowered down to reveal a bearded man who asked if she was working. Relieved to have finally found a paying customer for the night, Josefina could never have known that she wasn't talking to a man as she accepted his payment. She was talking to a monster. Climbing into the car, he introduced himself as Gary, making a quick stop at a McDonald's to get some coffee, telling her he would take her back to his house after. Getting a good look at him in the McDonald's, Josefina was confused by his appearance. He was wearing flashy jewelry and an expensive watch, and clearly had a very pricey car. Yet his clothes were shabby and stained. Driving to his house on North Marshall Street, Gary pulled into the driveway of a dilapidated property that again seemed mismatched with his other expensive items. He even had another luxury car parked on the drive, a 1971 Rolls-Royce. Stranger still, when Gary went to open his front door, he pulled out a key unlike anything she'd ever seen before. It had been split into 2 parts, with one half of the key already in the lock. Inside, the house was just as confusing to her. The door opened into a small kitchen with pennies glued in place across the walls. And when she followed him to the bedroom, she found that the upstairs hallway had $5 bills covering the floor. All of the furniture was worn and damaged. In the bedroom, Gary paid her fee before the 2 of them had sex. Finished with their business, Josefina started dressing when suddenly Gary jumped her from behind, grabbing her by the neck and choking her. Panicked and taken by surprise, Josefina could barely fight back, pleading with him to stop. And just as suddenly as he'd attacked her, he released her. For a brief second, it seemed as though he'd heard her pleas, but then he yanked her arms back behind her back and locked a pair of handcuffs onto her wrists. Pushing her down the stairs, he dragged her into the kitchen and through a door that led down to his basement. Forced down into the cold, damp space, barely even dressed, as she continued to plea and beg. Gary muttered that if she didn't shut up, that he would hit her with a piece of wood until she couldn't make a sound. Now silent in fear, he then tossed her down onto a filthy mattress and fastened metal clamps around her ankles. He poured glue onto them to secure them, using the heat from a hairdryer to make the adhesive dry quickly. As Josefina's eyes traced the clamps, she followed the chain all the way up to a large pipe on the ceiling. With Josefina securely in place, terrified of what he was going to do next, Gary sat down beside her and laid his head in her lap. Before long, he had drifted off to sleep. Exhausted herself, with no way to escape, eventually Josefina drifted off too. When she woke up, Gary was gone. The only source of light filtered in through gaps in a small boarded-up window. Around her, she could make out a chest freezer and a washing machine, and what looked like a battered pool table. And in the middle of the room, she could just about see that a section of the concrete floor had been broken up, with a shallow pit dug into the ground. It looked like Gary had been digging up a grave to bury her in once he was finished with whatever twisted plans he had for her. Eventually, Gary returned with a sandwich and a glass of juice for her. Although she was starving, Josefina refused to eat or drink it. For all she knew, it was drugged or poisoned. Unfazed, Gary took the food away and returned with tools to continue excavating the pit in the ground. As he began hammering away at the floor, he started opening up to his captive, telling her about his desire to build a large family. He told her that he already had 3 children with 3 different women, though he had no contact with any of them. So he'd come up with a new plan to build the family of his dreams. He was going to have 10 children, with 10 women he planned to keep captive and impregnate. And Josefina was the first of his chosen slaves. I'm not sure what would be scarier, to know this deranged monster was going to kill you, or to know that he wasn't. Finishing his work on the hole, Gary demanded that she have sex with him again, before leaving her alone in the basement. Wasting no time, the second he was gone, Josefina began fighting to free herself from her restraints. After a painful and agonizing struggle, she managed to slip one of the ankle clamps loose and slide her foot out. Still chained by the other ankle, she launched herself at the window, her bloodied fingers pulling the wooden boards away. She tried to escape through the open window she had now revealed, but the other restraint kept her firmly in place. And no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't get the second clamp to loosen at all. So she pulled as far as she could on the chain and shoved half her body through the window, enough that she could shout and scream for help, hoping that someone in the rundown neighborhood would hear her and come to her rescue. But nobody did. Instead, she was yanked back inside by Gary, who began beating her with a stick until she fell silent again. Enraged, he shoved her into the hole in the ground, even though she barely fit, having to hold her head tightly against her chest. Then, he placed a sheet of plywood over the opening and stacked heavy weights on top, pinning her in place. As she continued to scream, Gary plugged in a radio and cranked it up to its maximum volume before heading upstairs again. Struggling to breathe, let alone to keep screaming, it wasn't long before Josefina gave up the hopeless attempt for rescue. After spending an entire day in the hole with no sign of her captor, Josefina had all but resigned to her fate. This was how she was going to die. But then Gary finally returned, and this time he wasn't alone. Before we continue with what happened next, I think we need to take a look at who Gary was and how we ended up in this dark and disturbing place. So you know what that means. We're going to have to go all the way back to the start. Gary Michael Heidnik was born on November 22, 1943 in Eastlake, a suburb of Cleveland, Ohio. 18 months later, after the birth of his younger brother Terry, his parents Michael and Ellen divorced, and as a result he, along with his brother, was primarily raised by their father and his new wife. Clashing with their stepmother and facing harsh and abusive punishment from their father, the boy's home life was anything but happy. Gary's alcoholic father regularly mocked and taunted him over his bedwetting, going as far as to hang his soiled sheets out of their window for all their neighbors to see. It's worth pointing out, regular bedwetting beyond the usual ages is a very common trait among future serial killers. At school, Heidnik was bullied for having an oddly shaped head, a result of a childhood fall from a tree. Though he had few friends, he was highly intelligent, and he excelled in his studies. In 1957, Gary enrolled in the prestigious Staunton Military Academy in Virginia, intending to become an Army officer. Despite excelling academically there too, he unexpectedly dropped out before his graduation, and at 18 he decided to enroll in the regular Army. Thriving in the environment and regularly earning praise from his drill sergeant, he again struggled to develop any close friendships or bonds. After being rejected by a number of specialist units he applied to join, he was sent to San Antonio, Texas to train as a medic, before being transferred to a field hospital in West Germany. At the field hospital, he finally gained his GED, receiving an almost perfect score in the test. But by August 1962, just as things seemed to be finally progressing well for him, and he felt like he was finally starting to fit in, he began to suffer from severe headaches, blurred vision, and nausea. This led to him being diagnosed with gastroenteritis. But while he was being examined, A neurologist noted that he was showing signs of suffering from a mental disorder. Gary was prescribed a strong tranquilizer typically used to treat severe psychotic conditions and was sent back to a military hospital in Philadelphia. In less than 3 months, he was diagnosed with schizoid personality disorder, given an honorable discharge from the Army on medical grounds, and granted a full disability pension. After his discharge and diagnosis, Gary settled in Philadelphia, where he would go on to commit his disturbing crimes 20 years later. In the meantime, he earned a certificate as a licensed practical nurse and took some courses at the University of Pennsylvania. He worked various jobs, including at the University Hospital and at a veterans hospital, but was fired from them all due to his rudeness and poor attendance. As time went on, Gary's life continued to spiral downwards. He spent an increasing amount of time in psychiatric hospitals and attempted to take his own life on multiple occasions. While hospitalized, Gary was said to withdraw completely and become practically catatonic. In one disturbing incident, Gary was sectioned after attacking his brother Terry with a piece of wood. When he was released, he went to visit Terry as he recovered in hospital, telling his brother that if he had died, he would have disposed of his body in a bathtub of acid. Interestingly, his brother Terry found himself in an almost identical dark place throughout this time period, being hospitalized and attempting to take his own life multiple times too. Around the same time, in 1970, his birth mother Ellen, who had been battling bone cancer and alcoholism, took her own life by ingesting mercuric chloride, which only exacerbated Gary's already frail mental state. His behavior became increasingly erratic and bizarre, and he spent much of his time only communicating through written notes. Despite his unusual behavior, Gary's high intelligence allowed him to make a number of savvy investments in the stock market, turning his meager government checks from the army into a small fortune. It was at this point, when his mental and physical health was at its lowest, that Gary had an epiphany. He was going to found his own church. Whether this decision was fueled by any sort of real religious beliefs, his own delusions, or a desire to avoid paying tax on his growing fortune, however, is unclear. So in 1971, Gary founded the United Church of the Ministers of God in Philadelphia with a small investment of $1,500. He declared himself to be a bishop, starting with a congregation of 5 people he had convinced to follow him, including his brother Terry. As his number of followers slowly grew, he spent his time cycling between mental institutions and ministering services to them, providing him with the perfect opportunity to hone his skills in manipulation and coercion. Gary was also not a stranger to the police during this time. In 1976, he was charged with aggravated assault and carrying an unlicensed firearm after shooting at a man who was renting a house from him. Afterward, when the house was sold, the new owners discovered several boxes of pornographic magazines in the basement, alongside what appeared to be a hole someone had been digging in the concrete floor. Throughout this time, Gary had relationships with a number of women, most of whom were black and had mental disabilities, with his main goal appearing to be to have children with them. His girlfriend, Gail Linko, was the first to give birth to his child. Though due to Gail's mental challenges, their son was placed into foster care shortly after his birth. Similarly, Gary dated another mentally challenged woman, Anjanette Davidson, who he had a daughter with. But like his firstborn, his second child was quickly put into foster care due to her mother's various conditions. In 1978, Gary came under police scrutiny again, after he signed Anjanette's sister, Alberta, out of the mental institution she was staying at on a day pass, before keeping her locked in his house. Severely mentally disabled, Alberta was held captive in the basement where he sexually assaulted and abused her. She was later discovered shackled in a storage room in Gary's house, and returned to the hospital where doctors quickly recognized the severe nature of the trauma she had been through. Gary was immediately arrested and charged with multiple offenses, including kidnapping and sexual assault. Going to trial in November 1978, these charges would eerily mirror his future crimes. Pleading not guilty and defending himself in court, a psychological evaluation of Gary concluded he was manipulative and psychosexually immature, and he was found guilty of all charges and sentenced to 3 to 7 years in prison. However, an appeal led to the sentence being overturned, and instead he spent less than 3 years in mental institutions before being released back into the world on April 12, 1983. After his release, Anjanette mysteriously vanished, and many believe that Gary played a role in her disappearance. But with police failing to uncover any information about what happened to her, her disappearance remains unsolved to this day. In 1984, Gary then purchased the property at 3520 North Marshall Street that would later become infamous. Despite buying a modest house in a deprived neighborhood, Gary flaunted his wealth by purchasing a Cadillac and a Rolls-Royce for himself. This property would quickly become the place of worship for his church, with weekly Sunday gatherings which were mostly attended by vulnerable, mentally disabled people. Gary would regularly take his congregation on outings, such as going to amusement parks with them, and buying them burgers and fries. Many of his mentally impaired followers quite literally worshipped him, trusting him completely as he preyed on their need for acceptance, trust, and understanding. Living a double life as a bishop to his congregation, Gary's main goal was to find a new partner to have another child with. So he turned to a marriage service, where he met Betty Disto, a 22-year-old woman from the Philippines. After exchanging letters and phone calls, Betty agreed to marry him and traveled to Philadelphia in September 1985 to meet him. Married in less than a month, Betty soon discovered that Gary was sleeping with multiple other women, all black and with mental disabilities, after walking in on him. And it wasn't long before he began to physically and sexually assault her, threatening to kill her if she tried to leave him. He would even force her to watch as he had sex with the other women he'd bring back to the house. Reaching breaking point, on December 12, 1986, Betty confronted him about his behavior. But instead of resolving anything, Gary became enraged and viciously attacked and sexually assaulted her. 4 days later, after pretending to go shopping, she left and never returned. Though Gary wouldn't find out until much later, Betty was pregnant at the time and would go on to give birth to his third child. Less than 2 weeks later, and just after his parole for his last arrest had expired, Gary was arrested and charged with a litany of crimes thanks to Betty reporting what he did to her to the police. Once again, there was a chance for Gary to be stopped before his crimes got even worse. But sadly, Betty failed to appear at the preliminary hearing for the case, and as a result, the charges were dismissed. Throughout this time, Gary's church grew to more than 50 members and amassed more than $500,000 in its account, which is around $5 million adjusted for inflation. As his congregation gathered upstairs to attend his services, Josefina was being kept imprisoned in the hole in the basement beneath their feet. Among the members of Gary's church was a 24-year-old mentally disabled woman called Sandra Lindsay. Having known Gary for years after meeting at a facility for people with disabilities, Sandra considered him to be a good friend who had always looked out for her. She regularly had sexual encounters with Gary and another of his followers called Cyril Brown, and had once even become pregnant. However, not feeling ready to be a mother, she chose to have an abortion. When Gary discovered what she had done, he exploded in rage, calling her evil, and offering her $1,000 to carry his child, which Sandra refused. So Gary took matters into his own hands. Back inside the basement pit, despite the blaring radio, Josefina could clearly hear the sound of a woman's voice and the metallic clinking of a chain being dragged across the floor. Suddenly, the plywood board above her was pulled back and Josefina was yanked out of the hole by Gary. Her body barely even functioning, she struggled to stand, stumbling as she emerged from the pit to see another young black woman, naked except for a blouse, chained to the same ceiling pipe she had been on her first night in the basement. Gary introduced her as Sandra before leaving the basement. Alone with her, Josefina tried to engage her and find out anything she knew about what was going on. But she found Sandra to be detached and confused, quickly realizing that she was mentally disabled. Sandra calmly explained who she was, her relationship with Gary, and how she had ended up here. As Josefina tried to comfort her, Sandra began to grow increasingly frightened and distressed as the reality of the situation started to sink in. In less than an hour, Gary returned with what he called dinner for the two women: plain crackers and a bottle of water. Later that day, he continued digging the pit to make it deeper and wider, before he sexually assaulted both women and left them alone in the dark for the night. Broken both physically and mentally, the two practically naked women huddled together for warmth in the cold basement until morning, when Gary returned to bring them some oatmeal for breakfast. As they desperately ate the tiny portion of food, there was a sudden knock at the front door above. At the door was Sandra's sister, Tracy, alongside two of her cousins. Having been given his phone number by friends of Sandra from the congregation, they had already tried calling him for information on their sister's whereabouts, though he hadn't answered any of their calls. When nobody answered the door, they eventually left. Having immediately reported Sandra as missing, her family told the police that they believed she was being held captive by a man they knew only as Gary, living at 3520 Marshall Street. The officer assigned to Sandra's case did attempt to call Gary and even paid the house a visit, but he never received an answer. Knowing her family was looking for her, Gary forced Sandra to write a note to her mother, stating that she had left town and would call soon. When she'd written it, he told the two women he would take it to New York and send it from there, to make it seem like Sandra had run away. This singular statement from Gary told Josefina everything she needed to know about Gary's intentions. He wasn't going to let them go, which either meant he planned to keep them indefinitely as his prisoners, or that he had an even worse fate in mind for them. Unfortunately, Gary's plan worked. While Sandra's mother and family strongly believed she had been kidnapped, the officer saw the letter as an indication that Sandra had most likely run away rather than become a victim of abduction. Especially after a second letter, a Christmas card telling them not to worry, was received. As days turned to weeks, the two women remained trapped in the basement, starved and half naked, with Gary assaulting them whenever he wanted to. They occasionally tried to scream out for help, but their cries always brought brutal retaliation. Gary would savagely beat them, leave them confined in the dreaded pit for hours or even days, and torture them in cruel and twisted ways, such as suspending them from an overhead beam by a single arm, leaving them hanging in agony for hours. As you can imagine, with their bodies and their spirits broken, eventually they stopped screaming out for help, too afraid of the repercussions. 3 days before Christmas, with Josefina and Sandra trapped in the dark, cramped pit, Gary went out hunting for another victim to add to his twisted collection. And as he turned onto Lehigh Street in his Cadillac, he spotted the woman who would become his next captive. 19-year-old Lisa Thomas was heading over to a friend's house when Gary pulled up beside her in his luxury Cadillac, asking if she was a prostitute. Initially angered by his remark, Lisa softened when Gary apologized and put on his mask of charm. Unfortunately, he was able to convince her to get in the car so he could give her a ride to make up for his rude remark. Continuing to charm her as he drove her to her friend's house to pick something up, she soon agreed to go to dinner with him. So after she stopped off at her friend's house, the pair headed to a nearby restaurant. As the conversation progressed, with Gary flaunting his wealth, he offered to take her to Atlantic City the next day. When Lisa told him she wouldn't have anything suitable to wear if they did, he pulled out some money and told her they could go shopping and get her something to wear. So he took her to Sears, buying her new clothes. By the evening, Lisa felt comfortable enough to go back to Gary's house with him, where he put on a movie and poured her an alcoholic drink. Before long, with the drink going to her head, Lisa drifted to sleep. When she woke up, Gary was already undressing her. Before she could even question what he was doing, he dragged her up to his bedroom and forced himself on her. Once he had finished, Lisa started getting dressed as she asked him to take her back to her friend's house. But instead, Gary grabbed her by the throat and started choking her. He then handcuffed her and dragged her down to the basement to introduce her to what he called his friends. In the basement, he removed the plywood covering the pit and introduced her to Josefina and Sandra. I can't even imagine the horror that Lisa must have felt upon seeing the two half-naked, starved women stuffed inside the tiny pit, knowing that she was doomed to suffer the same fate. A mere 10 days later, Gary dragged a fourth victim into his basement, 23-year-old Deborah Dudley. However, while Gary had successfully managed to use violence and abuse to control his first 3 victims, Deborah refused to give in to him. From the moment he chained her in the basement, she defied every order and demand he put upon her. Despite being brutally beaten and tortured every time, she refused to back down. This shift in dynamic caused tension among the group of captives, as when Deborah disobeyed Gary, he didn't just punish her, he punished all of them. And the beatings and the torture ramped up to new levels of frequency and extremity. Whenever he left the house, Gary began designating one of the women as in charge, demanding a report of any misbehavior upon his return. When he came back, he would inquire whether anyone had disobeyed him. If the answer was no, he would punish them all brutally, essentially giving them no choice but to report on each other's actions if they wanted to avoid more violence. It was during this time that Josefina started to slowly gain her captor's trust, leading him to believe that she was loyal and submissive to him, and had genuinely accepted her role as one of his wives, a tactic which would eventually lead to her escape and his apprehension. Eventually, he brought a portable toilet into the basement, and some baby wipes for the women to clean themselves with. He also brought mattresses downstairs for the women to sleep on, offering them a small semblance of comfort when they were fortunate enough to be outside of the pit. After weeks of offering food erratically, Gary began feeding his captives canned dog food, enforcing compliance with violence until they ate it. Then on January 18th, Gary entered the basement with a 5th victim, an 18-year-old sex worker called Jacqueline Askins. Like the others, he lured her to the house before sexually assaulting her and chaining her in the basement. Gary's treatment of his 5 captives varied greatly depending on his mood. On some days, they were given the usual meal of dog food, while on other days, such as Josefina's birthday. He bought them a feast from a Chinese restaurant, complete with champagne. But any sense that Gary might be softening towards his captives in any way was completely put to rest in early February, after he caught Sandra trying to move the plywood boards off the pit to let the other women out from the damp hole. But he didn't beat her for her disobedience like usual. Instead, he cuffed one of her wrists to a ceiling beam and left her to hang by it for several days. It wasn't long before Sandra's already frail condition began to deteriorate, and after days in this position, dehydrated, barely fed, and running a high fever, she lost consciousness. When Gary released her from her handcuff, her limp body dropped to the floor, motionless. Accusing her of faking it, he kicked her, pushing her body into the pit. But when he checked, she had no pulse. Sandra was dead. Moments after Gary took Sandra's lifeless body upstairs, the remaining 4 women could hear the unmistakable sound of a power saw filling the house. Returning to the basement, Gary then took his newest captive, Jacqueline, upstairs to show her Sandra's partially dismembered body in his bathtub, before telling her, "We all gotta play a part in this." Gary then forced the terrified woman to cut off Sandra's arms for him as he watched. In the days following Sandra's death, an unbearably foul odor began to fill the house, causing the neighbors to complain to the police. When an officer came to investigate, Gary simply brushed off the smell as the result of an overcooked roast, leading the officer to dismiss the complaint and leave without any further investigation. In reality, the smell was the result of Gary using a food processor to grind Sandra's flesh, which he mixed with dog food to feed both his dogs and his captives, and from the rest of her remains, which he had been cooking on the stove. While the women struggled with the idea that they were being forced to eat Sandra, they had little choice but to obey or face punishment, which they now knew could even include death. Jacqueline was later quoted as saying, "If it wasn't for me eating her or eating dog food, I couldn't be here today." After Sandra's death, the remaining victims began secretly devising a plan to overpower their captor and escape. But before they had the chance to even attempt their scheme, with his psychosis and paranoia spiraling out of control, Gary devised a way to make sure they never could. He shackled their hands and feet, suspended them from a beam, and wrapped tape around their mouths. Then, he shoved screwdrivers into their ears and wriggled them around, hoping to deafen them. Only Josefina, who had managed to convince him that she was a good wife, was spared this torture. Josefina even began to receive small comforts like hot chocolate and hot dogs, and was allowed to sleep outside of the pit. Recalling what happened later on, Josefina admitted, "Anytime that you're cut off from the world outside, whoever's holding you captive, you're going to grow to like him regardless, because he's your only contact to things that are outside. He's your only source of survival." Even if she was quietly plotting her escape, her words make it clear that by this point she had started suffering from some degree of Stockholm Syndrome. With tensions between Gary, Josefina, and the other women escalating, Deborah's previous refusal to obey her captor intensified. So one day, Gary took her upstairs with the others waiting anxiously, expecting her to meet the same fate as Sandra. To their surprise, Deborah was returned safely to the basement. But any hint of fight she had seemed to have left her eyes. So when Gary left them alone, the other women asked her what had happened upstairs. Struggling to speak, Deborah told them that Gary took her to the kitchen and opened a pot on the stove, revealing Sandra's head inside. He then opened the oven to reveal part of Sandra's rib cage roasting inside. Next, he opened the fridge to show her various body parts, including an arm, wrapped in plastic. He coldly told her that he would do the same thing to her if she didn't start obeying his orders. While this intimidation tactic initially seemed to work on Deborah, it didn't take long for her to regain her composure and begin refusing to obey Gary again. So Gary introduced another sadistic method of punishment to try and force her submission. Using an exposed wire, he began to electrocute his victims by pressing it to their metal chains, watching as they screamed and writhed in pain from the jolts. Once again, he spared Josefina of this punishment. On March 18th, Gary decided on an even more horrific way to carry out his electroshock treatment. He drilled a small hole in the plywood covering of the pit and ordered Josefina, who he was now treating more like an accomplice than a captive, to pour water through it. With Deborah, Lisa, and Jacqueline inside the pit and bound by chains, he slid the wire through one of the holes, sending an electric current surging through all of them. Then, he ordered Josefina to push the live wire against Deborah's chain, causing her to convulse violently before collapsing face first into the water. As Lisa and Jacqueline screamed for him to stop and help, Gary eventually removed the plywood to see what was going on. Deborah was dead. The surviving women couldn't help but feel resentment towards Josefina, believing she was now not just cooperating with Gary to try and survive, but a willing participant in his cruelty, and in particular the death of Deborah. Dragging her body out of the wet pit and confirming she was dead, Gary showed no emotion, turning to the remaining women to say, "Now I can get back to having a peaceful basement." With Deborah dead, Gary went to get a pen and paper, ordering Josefina to write the time and date on the page, alongside a statement detailing her role in the murder of Deborah, telling her if she ever goes to the cops that he'll use it as proof that she was the one who killed her. Convinced with her obedient behavior and the threat of the confession letter looming over her that Josefina was now completely under his control, he unshackled her and sent her upstairs to change into regular clothes for the first time in 4 months. The following day, Gary wrapped Deborah's body in plastic, placed it in the freezer, and left the house. Except he didn't leave alone. While Lisa and Jacqueline remained chained in the cold, wet pit, he took Josefina out with him. Over the following weeks, Josefina accompanied Gary on shopping trips and went with him to restaurants, all the while maintaining the act of being his confidant. He repeatedly reminded her of the letter she had signed, warning that if he were ever caught, he would claim insanity, and she would be the one imprisoned, not him. He even made her share his bed with him at night. Alongside the change in Josefina's role, after Deborah died and resistance to his demands all but stopped in the basement, he began providing more comforts for his captives, such as pillows, blankets, and even a television. On March 22nd, Gary and Josefina loaded Deborah's partially frozen body into a van and drove to an area of dense woodland. Carrying the body into the woods, Gary dumped it among the trees. The following day, Gary took Josefina on a night drive through the streets in search of what he called a replacement for Deborah. Before long, they spotted a black woman on a street corner, who by pure coincidence both of them knew. Josefina recognized her as Agnes Adams, a dancer she had once worked with at a strip club, and Gary knew her as a prostitute he had previously paid to have sex with. Having had sex with him before at his house, where she was allowed to leave unharmed, Agnes had no reason to doubt Gary's intentions when he requested her services again. Back at his house, he left Josefina in the kitchen while he had sex with Agnes upstairs. But unlike her last encounter with him, this time she suffered the same fate as the other captives. She was stripped, chained, and locked in the basement pit with Lisa and Jacqueline. All of these moments helped convince Gary that Josefina was trustworthy, leading him to allow her to visit her family when she asked if she could, promising she'd bring back a new wife for him. On March 24th, Gary dropped her off near her home and arranged to meet her at a nearby gas station at midnight. As you know from the opening, Josefina immediately told the police what she had endured over the last 4 months, leading to them arresting Gary at the gas station later that night. In the early hours of the morning on the 25th, Detective James Hansen and a unit of officers arrived at Gary's house, breaking down the door to gain access. Among them was Officer David Savage, who had made the arrest of Gary at the gas station. Describing the scene, David said, "The stereo was going full volume and the TV in the dining room was at full volume with no picture. I went into the basement with a flashlight and observed 2 females lying on a mattress with a blanket. They were shackled, naked from the waist down. We said we were the police, and they started jumping up and down and hugging each other. They pointed to the corner, and I observed some bags of dirt over a board. I lifted the board up, and a black female who was naked jumped up out of the hole. She was shackled. We uncuffed her. All 3 girls started hugging each other and saying, 'Thank God we're saved.' The women were rescued from their horrific captivity and immediately given medical attention by paramedics stationed nearby. While the officers searched the house for any other possible victims, they found none. But what they uncovered in the kitchen was beyond anything they could have imagined. Sandy's forearm remained frozen in the freezer, and in the oven, they found charred bones, along with other body parts that would later be used as evidence in Gary's trial. Gary's crimes were so shocking and so far removed from his well-established persona as a wealthy and respected religious figure that they sparked a media frenzy. As the gruesome details of his actions were released to the public, many struggled to believe that anyone could commit such horrific crimes, or that they could do so without anyone noticing, particularly the congregation of his church who met every Sunday at the very house he was doing it all in. To this day, it remains unclear how much the members of his so-called church actually knew about his activities. Even after his arrest, while news outlets were broadcasting horrifying details about Gary's sickening actions, members of his congregation continued to gather at his home, dubbed the House of Horrors, every Sunday for worship. Gary's lawyer told reporters, "I was amazed. Usually in cases like this, the church is set up as a tax scam. But they really are holding services. After I took the case, parishioners were calling me and asking if they were still having services." Although I've not been able to confirm exactly when or why he was arrested, one member of Gary's congregation, Cyril Brown, was taken into custody around the same time as him and accused of being an accomplice to his crimes. Cyril had previously had a sexual relationship with Sandra prior to Gary kidnapping her, and he revealed to authorities that he had personally witnessed Gary dismembering her body in the bathtub, as well as claiming he had seen her head cooking in a pot on Gary's stove, and that he had helped label her body parts as dog meat. However, the prosecution granted him bail in exchange for his continued assistance in their investigation, with Cyril even claiming he was aware of a third murder Gary had committed. Cyril's lawyer stated, "It will be our position that he was victimized to the same extent as the women involved, although he was not hurt. Cyril fits the profile of each and every victim. He's retarded, he's black, he's handicapped, he's slow." Cyril was so mentally disabled that he had to be asked the question, "What is your name?" a number of times before being able to understand what investigators wanted from him. Ultimately, it appears that in exchange for his testimony against Gary, given how mentally handicapped Cyril was, he was deemed to be a victim too, and he wasn't charged with any crimes. As the preliminary hearing for Gary's trial was set into motion, the other surviving women all struggled with conflicting feelings about Josefina's actions. She had saved them from the hell they had been forced to endure, but she had also played a role in their torture and abuse. Some of them even pushed for Josefina to have charges pressed against her for what she'd done. On April 23, 1987, Gary appeared in court for the first time since his arrest, represented by attorney Chuck Peruto, a well-known defense lawyer with a reputation for handling high-profile cases. Assistant District Attorney Charles Gallagher presented the state's case against Gary, charging him with a litany of crimes including murder, kidnapping, sexual assault, and false imprisonment. In a bizarre move, Gary initially claimed that the women had already been living in the house when he purchased it, and denied any involvement in their abduction. Strangely, this was the exact same claim that Harrison Graham had made in his case. Lisa, Jacqueline, and Agnes all testified about how Gary had chained, tortured, and sexually abused them over the course of their imprisonment in his basement, offering details that shocked and horrified the courtroom. Josefina also recounted her experience, giving vivid descriptions of how Sandra and Deborah were murdered, admitting to being the one who had pushed the live wire into the pit to kill Deborah. As you can imagine, Peruto tried to shift the blame onto Josefina. This was further muddied when the other three survivors gave varying accounts of Josefina, as either being a willing participant or as acting out of fear for her own life. Jacqueline would later state, for example, "She killed Debbie and we all could have gotten out of there alive. There was a lot of stuff she did she didn't have to do. I just thought she took on her serial killer ideal too. She was the oldest. She was supposed to protect us. Even though she was in a bad situation, she was still supposed to protect us." However, the district attorney chose not to file charges against Josefina. They determined that while she had participated under Gary's coercion, she was a victim herself and had ultimately saved the others. The final testimony came from Dr. Paul Hoyer, a county medical examiner, who read off a chilling list of the human remains found in Gary's home, with 24 pounds of human body parts found inside Gary's refrigerator alone. After the initial hearing, jury selection began for a trial set to start on June 20th, 1988. Surprisingly, I'm yet to come across any clear indication that detectives looked at Gary as a legitimate suspect in the Frankford Slasher case during this time. Given at the point he was arrested, the slasher had killed 5 women, all who were similarly vulnerable and with similar mental health or mental disability issues. It feels like to me he would have been a solid suspect for the brutal unsolved murders occurring in the same area at the same time he was torturing victims in his house. Not to mention, Gary bears at least somewhat of a similarity to the description of the suspect in the slasher cases given by many different witnesses. Furthermore, Gary called himself a bishop, and there was a lot of talk about someone called the minister being involved in the slasher murders. However, given the slasher's crimes continued after Gary's arrest, committing another 4 murders that are known over the next 2 years, it seems clear that he was not the one responsible for the crimes. Whether he had an association with the person responsible, however, is less clear. Over the first 2 days of the trial, Judge Lynn Abraham and the jury listened to testimony from the victims, their families, law enforcement officers, and medical examiners. The case against Gary was solid and difficult to dispute. Listening to the testimony, Sandra's sister Tracy later told reporters, "No one can truly understand what it's like to hear in excruciating detail how someone you love died." However, Peruto and the defense took the strategy of trying to prove that Gary was legally insane. They relied heavily on the testimony of two key experts, psychiatrist Dr. Clancy McKenzie and psychologist Jack Apshey. Having spent over 100 hours with Gary, Dr. McKenzie claimed that at the time of the crimes, Gary did not know the difference between right and wrong. However, McKenzie spent the majority of his time on the stand ranting and rambling about his own theories around mental health conditions, making it seem as though he had another agenda to involve himself in such a high-profile case, barely even discussing Gary. Unfortunately for the defense, the testimony of Dr. Apshey also didn't go the way they had hoped, with Judge Abraham ruling that the majority of it, which delved into Gary's background, was inadmissible. Now desperate, Peruto called a third psychiatrist, Dr. Kenneth Kuhl, to the stand, hoping to salvage his defense, but this also backfired. After Dr. Kuhl's testimony was deemed to be confusing to the jury, it too was ordered to be stricken from the record, and under cross-examination, he revealed that he had only spent 20 minutes with Gary to evaluate his mental state. In a final blow to the insanity defense, the prosecution called Gary's broker, Robert Kirkpatrick, to the stand, where he testified that Gary was an astute investor who knew exactly what he was doing. Throughout the trial, Gary continued to claim his innocence and warned of the consequences if he were convicted. He argued that executing him would be the end of capital punishment in Pennsylvania, stating, "I say, real or phony, they can execute me, because I am innocent and I can prove it. When you execute an innocent man, knowingly execute an innocent man, you know there will be no more capital punishment in this state and possibly anywhere else in this country. And you know I didn't kill them two women. Go ahead and execute me. Yes, I want you to execute an innocent man so there will be no more capital punishment." On June 30th, 1988, after 16 hours of deliberation, the jury announced their verdict in the case, and Gary was found guilty of all charges put against him. The next day, the jury reached a unanimous decision and sentenced Gary to death for the murders of Sandra and Deborah, with Gary showing no visible emotion as the sentence was read aloud. He was sent to the State Correctional Institution in Pittsburgh to await his execution. For 11 years, Gary remained in prison, waiting as the usual legal processes surrounding a death sentence played out. During this period, he made multiple attempts to take his own life and took little part in his own appeals. In 1997, Gary's daughter, Maxine Davidson White, and his ex-wife, Betty Disto, filed a federal lawsuit to delay his execution, arguing that Gary was not mentally fit to be executed. After 2 years of legal battles, the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania ruled in favor of proceeding with the execution. At one of the hearings, Gary attacked his own defenders, claiming he wanted to be executed despite claiming he was innocent, stating, "Them women were down there killing each other. And even though I can prove my innocence, I still refuse to appeal my case. I resent this kind of shit being done to a disabled veteran." Ultimately, on July 6, 1999, Gary ate his final meal of black coffee and 2 slices of cheese pizza, before being prepared for his execution by lethal injection. That day, Maxine visited her father for an hour, but chose not to stay to see him be executed. Sandra's sister, Tracy, alongside other family members and the family of Deborah, attended the execution, as did one of his victims, Jacqueline Askins, who said, "I wanted my face to be the last thing he saw." According to Tracy, "I went to the execution, but it was too calm and serene for me. I'm thinking execution is something like, turn around and let me shoot you. Instead, they just stuck a needle in his arm. He never looked at us, never acknowledged us, never said he was sorry. He didn't say anything. He didn't even look in our direction." In another interview after his death, she stated, "I really wanted him to stay in jail. I wanted him to do time because I wanted him to not be able to run away from the women that he killed. Because I know that they spooked him. I know that they came back to haunt him. His death was so much easier than his victims." Similarly, Jacqueline was quoted as saying, "I watched him die. It didn't bring no satisfaction." And Josefina, who didn't attend the execution, later told reporters, "It would have been better for him to sit in a 4x4 cell." At the time of his death, no family members had made arrangements to claim his body. And 25 years later, Gary still holds the grim distinction of being the last man executed in Pennsylvania. After the trial, Josefina returned to sex work for about a year before managing to turn her life around working various legitimate jobs and being reunited with her 3 children. She is now married and living in Atlantic City, and claims that years of therapy have helped reduce the amount of panic attacks she has, although seeing chains or handcuffs on TV still sets her off. Josefina ultimately went on to write a book called Cellar Girl about her experience, stating, "For a long time I was haunted by Heidnik, by the women who died next to me, but not any longer. I hope I can inspire other victims to feel positive about the future." Jacqueline continued to live in Philadelphia, finding work as a house cleaner and remaining close to her 2 sons. Suffering from hearing loss and with medication to manage her anxiety and PTSD, she continues to struggle with flashbacks and has not entered a basement since she escaped. In a 2021 documentary, Jacqueline had the chance to confront Josefina about her role in the events that transpired. After initially telling her that she used to hate her, she told her that she'd come to terms with the fact that Josefina did the best she could to survive, and that she's the reason the survivors are all alive today. Agnes and Lisa, however, both faced ongoing mental health challenges and addiction issues as a result of the trauma they experienced. Initially awarded a $30,000 settlement each, the 4 survivors pursued civil litigation to access the funds in Gary's affluent accounts, seeking to divide the money equally as some degree of compensation for the crimes committed against them. Similarly, the IRS attempted to gain access to the funds, and it remains unclear whether either party succeeded in obtaining money from his accounts. Gary's lawyer, Peruto, later claimed that Gary had specifically targeted black women because he was trying to create a perfect race of children. He also claimed that there was no evidence that Gary had fed the other victims the remains of Sandra, but that he'd leaked the story to reinforce his insanity defense. When questioned why Gary looked unkempt with such a long beard throughout the trial, bearing a resemblance to Charles Manson, Peruto admitted that it was part of his plan, stating, "If you want to demonstrate that someone is insane, then they gotta effing look insane. During the trial he looked like a total whack job. Did I do that? Yes." In a recent interview, he even stated that, "I always regretted not winning it," in regards to Gary's case. What ultimately became of the members of his congregation, including his potential accomplice Cyril, is unclear, as is the extent to which they knew what was going on in their house of worship. While it's difficult to imagine none of them were aware anything was amiss, it is important to remember that his congregation was made up almost entirely of severely mentally disabled people who Gary was able to easily deceive and manipulate. And with that, our exploration of this dark and disturbing case, and the final part of our deep dive into the Philly 3, has come to an end. Each of these cases, the Frankford Slasher, Harrison Graham, and Gary Heidnik, have all been equally complex and equally horrific. It's really shocking to think that all 3 of these serial killers were operating in a small area of Philadelphia at the exact same time, targeting the exact same sorts of vulnerable women, and were completely unrelated or unconnected to one another. While I know Gary technically isn't a serial killer because he only has 2 confirmed victims, I think it's pretty clear that he was a serial killer who was stopped before he could continue killing. Gary would have happily killed any of his victims at any point he wanted, and almost certainly would have killed more women had he not been arrested. I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts about this case down in the comments section below, and what you think about all the Philly 3 cases, and whether these oddly similar crimes might have had some form of connection to one another that I've missed. If you found this video interesting, please like and subscribe, and consider either becoming a channel member or joining my Patreon if you'd like to support me further. I can't offer a lot in the way of perks at the moment, so it would really just be a gesture of support for the time being. No pressure, but it's of course massively appreciated. Until next time, you have been watching The Mystery Abyss.